Thank you, Madam President. Today is an incredibly important day in the history of our state. On this date, in 1777, our state's first constitution was ratified and adopted in the city of Kingston. The Constitution, the first chartering document of the newly declared independent New York, was drafted primarily by prominent founding fathers John Jay and Gouverneur Morris, both of whom would go on to sign the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and Robert Livingston, who represented New York at the Second Continental Congress, was a member of the Committee of Five who drafted the Declaration of Independence and administered the first oath of office to George Washington in 1789. The process of drafting the Constitution began almost immediately after the Declaration of Independence was announced in July of '76. The New York Provincial Congress, a committee of colonists who favored independence that began organizing themselves in 1775 to support the war effort, met in the city of White Plains on July 10, 1776, to begin the work of creating a new government now that the colony of New York had declared itself free and independent. The work of the Provincial Congress was delayed and disrupted by the imminent invasion of New York City by British forces. The Congress had to adjourn repeatedly and seek out safer locations away from the British Army, a situation that became more desperate with the Continental Army's defeats across Long Island and New York City, and their ultimate retreat across the river to New Jersey. As winter settled in and the British made camp in New York City, the Provincial Congress fled to upstate Kingston to continue their efforts at mobilizing for the war effort and drafting the Constitution. Finally, on April 20th, 1777, 244 days ago, and with only one dissenting vote, the Provincial Congress of New York, renaming itself the Convention of Representatives of the State of New York, adopted and ratified the new Constitution. Remarkably, this new Constitution was not submitted to the general public for ratification or support. The ongoing war made that nearly impossible. Our first Constitution had 42 sections and clocked in at just under 7,000 words. It included in its preamble the entire text of the Declaration of Independence. It did not have a formal Bill of Rights, but it did include a right to trial by jury, a right to counsel in felony cases, and a right to due process, as well as prohibitions against bills of attainder and protections of religious freedom and liberty of conscience. The Constitution made no mention of slavery, nor did it even include a process for future amendments. But it was the first state constitution, and therefore the first in our nation's history, to require that legislative representation be based on equal population, and that every 7 years the apportionment of legislative seats be reallocated based on changes in the population. It's amazing to me that this is still an issue that we are discussing and debating today when our state's forefathers so easily provided us with the solution some 240-odd years ago. Our first Constitution was in many ways a precursor to the U.S. Constitution that will be adopted a decade later. For example, looking at the records we have available of the deliberations and debates, the state Senate, this very body, was designed to be a filter for public opinion, much like the U.S. Senate was designed to be the saucer that cools the tea that we so often learn about in our social studies classes. Over the years, our state, the structures of our government, the rights bestowed to our people, and the obligations of those people vis-a-vis their government have changed greatly. In fact, the state of New York has ratified 4 different constitutions in its history: 1777, 1821, 1846, and 1894. And in between all those years, the Constitution has been amended hundreds of times. Now, I could spend hours and hours going through this history in greater detail, but I won't. I will just note one interesting historical fact, that in 1858, our state legislature approved a resolution calling for a constitutional convention for the express purpose of disbanding the entire state government and transferring all governing authority to the New York Central Railroad. They submitted that amendment for ratification to the public, and it failed by just 6,000 votes. We would have quite a different history if that amendment had actually been passed. Now, I'm sure many of you here are wondering, what's the big deal? Why is this so important? Why should we care? What is this all about? And the answer is really simple. We tend to place such a premium on discussing our federal Constitution. We talk about it all throughout our education, beginning in elementary school. We talk about the U.S. Constitution as if it were some sort of religious document that holds the eternal truths that support our own personal political views. We spend so much time debating and discussing the constitutional powers of the federal government, Congress, the Supreme Court, presidency. And yet, despite the Constitution's sacred importance to our national civic identity, we often overlook just how important state governments really are. States, the laboratories of democracy, as Justice Brandeis reminds us, have a more fundamental impact on our day-to-day lives as citizens than the federal government ever has and perhaps ever will. And in a world that depends on an engaged and educated citizenry to fulfill the promise of self-government, what could be more important than starting with the very foundational charter that outlines the rights, privileges, powers, and responsibilities of a government that directly affects our lives each and every day? We should care about our state constitution and its history because it is the blueprint for a government of, by, and for us, the people, New Yorkers. And so today, April 20th, I want to wish you all a happy 420. That is a happy New York Constitution Day. Thank you, Mr. President.